Hello hockey fans, Oddman Rush here and welcome back to another video. Now last weekend, I asked you guys a question via my YouTube community tab post and my Twitter, which was, who is the most overrated player in the NHL and why? Now you guys gave me a variety of responses, both players that are active in the NHL currently today and players throughout NHL history who, you know, have certain reputations that they've gone down with, and I figured it could be a kind of fun video for me to sit here and respond to the players that you guys suggested and give my opinion as to whether I think they're overrated or not. So yeah, let's just get into it, shall we? First up, we have Nash Potatoes on Twitter, which is a wonderful name I might add, who says Erik Carlson because he's a defenseman who gets a lot of points. Well, unfortunately, that's what wins you Norris trophies in the NHL at this point in time. It's kind of what's always won Norris trophies in the NHL throughout history, so being a defenseman that scores a lot of points is kind of part and parcel of being a top defenseman in the NHL. I think for the last few years, Erik Carlson hasn't been overrated. I think he's kind of been rated for the most part, seeing as he hasn't really been very good. He had several injuries and surgeries, and his time in San Jose with the Sharks really has not been very good, but it looks like we've got a healthier, energized, maybe determined Erik Carlson this season, and I don't think there's anything wrong with both Sharks fans and the NHL celebrating that Erik Carlson is now back to his previous Ottawa Senators Norris Trophy winning form. I think the fact that he struggled for so many years proved that he wasn't overrated, and I think everyone's expectations for him came down significantly, and we weren't expecting him to be the same guy again and again, and we were disappointed season after season. But the fact that he's kind of come out of nowhere and he's leading all defensemen in scoring, or he's one of the top defensemen in scoring so far this season, into his mid-30s, that's quite an impressive feat, and I don't think we should take it away from him just because he had a good career. He was overrated maybe during his time in Ottawa, and then he crashed and burned during most of his stint in San Jose. Finally, the Sharks are getting some payback on that contract they gave him, that monster contract, over $10 million a year, and Erik Carlson is finally living up to the player that we used to see him as, so I'm not necessarily sure I would say he's overrated. Throughout his entire career, it's been a very up and down, turbulent journey, so me personally, I'm just quite glad to see Erik Carlson back to his previous self and back to the Norris Trophy capable guy that we've seen before. The NHL is a better place when a guy like Erik Carlson is leading from the back end and he's putting up points and he's competing for Norris trophies. It gives you that kind of 2011, 2012 feel of the NHL, and if you're a Senators fan from back then, you'll remember how fun that time was. So I'm rooting for you, Erik Carlson. Keep it up, buddy. Next up, we have Sakic fan who says Jack Eichel. I'm just going to leave it at that. I don't necessarily agree that Jack Eichel is the most overrated player in the NHL. I think similarly to Carlson, he's had a lot of issues with injuries over the last few seasons, and unlike Carlson, the team's handling of Eichel's injuries as well has been a big discussion point, especially during the time. Obviously, I can see it from both perspectives. Jack Eichel finds this groundbreaking breakthrough research and breakthrough surgery that he can take in order to basically restart his NHL career, whereas the Sabres see it and go, well, it's never been done on an athlete before who successfully recovered and reached the maximum of their potential again, so we're not sure if this is the right thing to do. Ultimately, Jack Eichel got to do the surgery, it worked out perfectly, so great. That's such good news for Jack Eichel personally, whether it be as a player or a person in general, and the fact that he's now having success again with the Vegas Golden Knights is brilliant. I think it's been abundantly clear that Jack Eichel, even since the 2015 NHL draft when he was drafted one position behind Conor McDavid, he's always played second fiddle to Conor McDavid at the very least. Obviously, when they first started out, it was very much McDavid is the best guy in the NHL, he's the heir apparent to Sidney Crosby's throne, and then there's Jack Eichel, who's also a solid player. Now, he probably would have gone first overall in a different NHL draft, but at the same time, I don't think he's ever been compared to that same generational, once-in-a-lifetime kind of player that Conor McDavid has, you know? Now that's unfair on him because he should be judged by his own talents and his own merits, and it's kind of unfair to compare him to somebody that nobody else can really be compared to in the modern NHL because nobody's really played as well as Conor McDavid has. But obviously, the NHL and sports fans love to do their comparisons. We love to say whether this player is as good, better, or worse than a different player. And Jack Eichel isn't Conor McDavid. I think that's been clear since his career began. He's been a solid player, a solid point producer in the NHL. He's finding success with the Vegas Golden Knights, which is so good for him, so good for Vegas as well. So that partnership seems to be paying dividends and then some. So yeah, I wouldn't say Jack Eichel is the most overrated guy. I think he was one of the most controversial players in the NHL for a time. He was one of the most discussed players in the NHL, despite the fact that he wasn't actually playing games at that time. But no, I wouldn't say he's the most overrated. I think he's well and truly rated at this point. We know he's a superstar in the league. We know he can put up solid point production. He's been a leader before. He's worn a letter on his jersey. And yes, his divorce from the Buffalo Sabres didn't necessarily go the way that either side probably would have wanted, but at the end of the day, it kind of seemed like it needed to happen. And I don't think that affects whether he's overrated or underrated. So Jack Eichel, I think he's pretty rated. I kind of disagree with this comment, you know. Moving on to Mathis Gosselin, who says Leon Draisaitl because he's a power play merchant who's defensively liable, and you don't win with a guy who gives zero effort unless he's in the offensive zone on the power play. Now, I think that's a little bit unfair to Leon Draisaitl. I think he's more well-rounded of a player than just a power play merchant or something like that. But do I think Leon Draisaitl is potentially overrated, especially by a lot of Edmonton Oilers fans? Yeah, I can see an argument for that, you know. Obviously, he led the league in scoring a couple of seasons ago, so he has that pedigree to be a top guy. He's one of the best German-born players the NHL has ever and probably will ever see, and his career is far from over at this point. He's probably going to have a long, successful, maybe even Hall of Fame career by the time he's done. Of course, we'll have to wait and see. But do I think he's overrated? Maybe. I think the argument that he's somewhat of a defensive liability does hold some weight, especially given that the Edmonton Oilers, they don't have that clear defensive ability from their top two centers to be able to shut down opposing teams' players. They kind of have relied on the 80s Oilers method of winning games, which is put the puck in the net more times than the other team, and it doesn't matter if we win a game like 8-7 or 9-8, you know? Obviously, that doesn't really work in the NHL, and I think where the Edmonton Oilers are sitting in the standings at the moment is kind of reflective of that. Obviously, there's no iron team, there's plenty of other skaters on the Edmonton Oilers roster, but you need guys like Leon Draisaitl and Conor McDavid to not only rack up the points and lead the league in scoring, you need them to be good in their own zone and be solid 200-foot guys. I think they've improved since they've entered the league, because there's been a lot of criticism, both around Draisaitl and McDavid, in terms of how they play in the defensive side of the game. There has been improvement, but is it still enough to make them equally rated as they should be? No, I don't think so. Maybe. Obviously, Conor McDavid is a different beast to Leon Draisaitl, but I think Draisaitl is overrated somewhat, especially by Oilers fans, because of his offensive production. Yes, it's a big part of the game, and scoring goals is the name of the game, and the most important thing in the sport, of course, but just as important is keeping the puck out of your own net. And I don't think Draisaitl has shown enough defensive prowess and enough ability in his own zone and within the 200-foot game to prove that he is equally rated compared to the hype that he's getting. So in terms of this response, I like Leon Draisaitl as a player, but yeah, I do think he is a little bit overrated, especially from Edmonton Oilers fans. Yeah, sorry Draisaitl, but you need to improve the defensive game. Now we have Michael Steuven on Twitter who says Rasmus Ristolainen, I don't know how he earns so much money. I gotta agree with you here, Michael. I really don't understand why the Flyers gave Ristolainen such a long and expensive contract. Pretty much from the second it was signed, everyone on Twitter and social media were like, wait, what? You did that, Chuck Fletcher? But clearly Fletcher and the Flyers front office are really big on him and think he's going to be a big asset for the future. Unfortunately, his metrics, both in his own zone and with his offensive production over the last few seasons, hasn't really reflected that. So I think they're kind of hoping he bounces back to his early Buffalo days or his mid-Buffalo Sabres days and goes back to being a 40-50 point guy. But the problem is, for being a 40-50 point guy, he sucks in his own zone, which as a defenseman, that's not good. Yes, you do have to be a high-scoring defenseman if you want to win the Norris Trophy, but equally, you should also be proficient in your own zone as well, because you're a defenseman. It's kind of part of your name, you defend. That said, I don't think Ristolainen is overrated within the league, because outside of Chuck Fletcher and the Flyers front office, from the second that contract was signed, everybody thought it was a ridiculous move that was going to bite them in the butt several years down the line. So I wouldn't say he's overrated. I would say that he's kind of become a bit of a meme over the last few years and he's overpaid, but overpaid doesn't necessarily mean overrated to anybody outside of the Flyers organization. So clearly they overrate him, but the rest of the NHL doesn't. Next, we have Donnie Coral Jr. on Twitter who says, as a Blackhawks fan, it has to be Seth Jones. He's not worth $9.5 million. So once again, similar to Ristolainen, we have another defenseman who's being severely overpaid, but just because you're overpaid doesn't necessarily mean that you're overrated. Obviously, Seth Jones, he signed that contract. Maybe the Blackhawks should have tried to get a lower average annual value, something maybe like the $8 million mark, but given his performance with the Columbus Blue Jackets and given the market for defensemen at the time, especially a right-handed shot like Seth Jones, which are in very short supply and in very high demand across the NHL. The fact that he earned $9.5 million isn't surprising. Obviously, since he signed that contract and since I'm pretty sure it kicked in this season or last season, yeah, it really has not worked out very well for the Blackhawks, has it, so far? Obviously, it comes with the caveat of the Blackhawks are currently in a rebuild, and they're looking to get rid and trade all of their veteran older players and usher in the next generation of Blackhawks talent, kind of similar to what they did with Taves and Kane back in the day, but given that he's signed this lengthy anchor contract with the Blackhawks and given his age and his experience in the league, I would imagine that Seth Jones is expected to be one of the mainstays on the Blackhawks roster who's going to be around after the rebuild is over, and given his performance so far for the Blackhawks, rebuild or not, it just hasn't been up to scratch. He hasn't been that number one top pair defenseman that the Chicago Blackhawks have needed. Yes, obviously his numbers could improve somewhat if they had better, more veteran guys, more experienced players on the roster to kind of help shelter him a little bit and kind of add an overall value to the rest of the roster and make them more competitive every night. But ultimately, he's expected to be the number one guy. He's earning money like a number one guy on the back end, and he hasn't lived up to it. So once again, he's not overrated. I think most of the NHL is aware that Seth Jones is overpaid, and overpaid doesn't necessarily mean overrated. So we've had a couple of defensemen here that they're overpaid for their talents. That doesn't necessarily mean they're overrated. It just sucks for the teams involved, but the players make a decent chunk of change, so can't really complain if you're the player, can you? Penultimately, we have a comment from Reb Tevya, which is a wonderful name, shout out to Fiddler on the Roof, brilliant musical, who says Drew Doughty. Now, similar to Erik Carlson, a former Norris winner who signed a big contract with the LA Kings, has spent his entire career in California, won the first 2 Stanley Cups in franchise history with the team, so he kind of earned that contract, maybe more so than Erik Carlson did, due to the success that he brought his organization during that tenure before signing the deal. But once again, is overpaid overrated? I think with Drew Doughty, when he was in his prime, when he was a Norris Trophy winning defenseman, Stanley Cup winning, Olympic gold medal winning defenseman, Drew Doughty was one of, if not the best defenseman across the entire NHL. I don't think you can deny that based on his numbers, his leadership quality, his play on the ice. Yes, you could once again make the argument that his offensive play was better than his defensive play, and as he's gotten older, I think that's only worsened as time's gone on, both offensively and defensively, like most players do, of course. But at the same time, I don't think he's overrated now because we know that he's an aging defenseman on the tail end of a contract who clearly doesn't have that extra jump in his step anymore, and he's kind of towards the tail end of his career, so I don't think it's fair to say that he's overrated right now. Could you say throughout his NHL career that he was overrated? Maybe, but at the same time, he won Norris trophies, he won the LA Kings their first 2 Stanley Cups in franchise history, and he was a big part of that and all of the success that the Kings have had during the 2010s and 2020s, so I don't necessarily say that Drew Doughty is overrated. I think he was a solid defenseman during his prime. I think he's been a decent defenseman in the years since, and obviously over the last couple of years, as Father Time has caught up with him, he's been a somewhat underwhelming defenseman for his contract, but when the LA Kings and Doughty signed that deal, they knew that was going to be the situation, so I feel like he's a rated defenseman. Everyone knows that he's not the Doughty that he was 5-10 years ago, and that's okay, because during those 5-10 years ago, he brought the team all the success that they could have wanted, so I don't think Drew Doughty's overrated. I think he's pretty fairly rated, both during his prime and now. And finally, we have a comment from Nick Ross who says, Conor McDavid. You've got to be kidding though, right? The Conor McDavid. You know, that guy that just finished top 5 in scoring by players aged 25 or younger throughout NHL history and coming close to the likes of Lemieux and Gretzky? That Conor McDavid? Yeah, he's definitely overrated, right? Now, all jokes aside, there is no denying that Conor McDavid is the most offensively talented, the fastest, the most skilled, the best player in the NHL currently during the 22-23 season, but is he overrated overall? I think you could potentially make an argument to say so. Like I said during the Draisaitl comment, I mentioned obviously McDavid and his defensive struggles. Whilst they have improved over the last few seasons, I think they are still a bit of an issue that are stopping him and the Oilers from becoming a perennial championship contender. Obviously, they made it deep into the playoffs last year. They're looking to be a playoff team this year, although they have had their struggles during the first half of the season. But the fact that Conor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, but especially McDavid, has been so incredible, is leading the league by far in both goals and points, and the fact that the Oilers are kind of treading water around the wildcard spots and they're barely squeaking in or just about being kicked out on any given night, I think that's really troublesome. And I think Conor McDavid is the most perfect example of you can have the most skilled, most talented, most offensively gifted player in the NHL who's scorching the record books and making his mark on the history books, but at the end of the day, there's no I in team. You need a solid team built around him and a solid group of players on that 20-man roster in order to get the job done and lead you to championships. You take a look at all of the different championship teams throughout the last decade or so, they've all been solid teams. Yes, they've had their superstar talent, but they've also been solid teams all round. They have those depth guys that can step up when the moment needs them to. They have that defensive core, or they have that goaltender that can shut the game down and take things over when they need to. They have that offensive player that can score that clutch goal when nobody expects them to, and the entire script has been flipped. Yes, you have that guy with Conor McDavid, and you could even argue you have another one of those guys in Leon Draisaitl, but the rest of the team just isn't strong enough. Jack Campbell has had a really poor start with the Edmonton Oilers. Stuart Skinner has been okay for the team, but like I said, they're treading water around the wildcard spot. For a team that made it to the conference finals last year, that's simply not good enough. So, Conor McDavid, is he overrated? Offensively, no. The rest of his game, maybe there could be the argument there. Clearly something's wrong with the Edmonton Oilers. Is part of that to do with Conor McDavid? I guess it's up to you to decide. In my opinion, I'm not so sure. And on that note, I'm going to end today's video. What do you guys think about the players that we discussed, or the thoughts that I provided on them? Do you agree with what I have to say? Do you completely disagree? Or are we going to meet somewhere in the middle? Like I say with a lot of these videos, we don't have to agree on everything. There is room for debate and room for discussion, and that's what makes these types of videos very fun to do. So do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear what you guys think. But thank you very much for watching, guys. I do hope you have enjoyed. Please feel free to like, subscribe, share, or watch some of my other videos. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye. A big thank you to Bexy93, Burned Retinas, Drew Fawcett, Houston NG, Raquel, and Worthless Pieces for helping support this video via Patreon. If you too want to help support the channel a little bit further and get a shout out at the end of every future video, make sure you head over to patreon.com/oddmanrush and become a patron today.